Step into your time travel machine and get ready to go back to ancient Egypt. The only issue is that while you'll be learning about ancient pharaohs and famous monuments, you'll also be discovering the very weird and revolting stuff the ancient Egyptians did. In this video, our experts have delved deep into the history books to find some of the most disturbing and disgusting things the ancient Egyptians did. From horrifying hair lice issues to the burial of King Tut, you'll find out weird things that you probably didn't want to know about the ancient Egyptians and their actual way of life. It's easy for us to think that the ancient Egyptian way of life seems cool while we sit in front of a computer, but it definitely wasn't the case back then. During the actual time period, life was much stranger than we give it credit for. Now let's dive in and explore the bizarre and terrifying things the ancient Egyptians did. Headlice. In ancient Egypt, shaving your head was common. From the pictures and records kept over the centuries, it was clear that this was the case. But why? Many people thought it was just a bizarre fashion choice until historians discovered the reason: lice. Ancient Egypt was filled with lice, and hygiene was not a priority for many at the time. Remedies existed but weren't effective or just plain didn't work. As a way to avoid the lice infestation, shaving clean was the best option. Men and women alike typically shaved their heads clean of all hair, and women would often wear wigs, which could be discarded if infested with lice. While there were ways to stop the lice, it was a nationwide infestation, and there just wouldn't be a way to win against them until modern medical advancements were made much later. During this time, ancient Egyptians went around shaved from head to toe. If you're wondering if there were any places these Egyptians didn't shave, the answer is that it's unlikely. Lice were just too big of a deal. Flashing. Catcalling might seem to many like a new invention, but others find it comforting to know that this behavior has been around since the very dawn of time. If anything, the catcalling of today was much worse during the ancient times in Egypt. According to Herodotus, men would sail on boats as part of a religious observance. On their voyage, they'd yell out lewd comments and pull up their garments as they passed through the towns. The purpose of this was to try and excite women so much that they'd jump into the water and swim after the boat. It appears that these catcalling tactics back then were even more aggressive than they are now. Thankfully, it didn't take too long for society to understand that these types of behaviors were inappropriate and made women feel unsafe. During the era of ancient Egypt, however, these practices were incredibly common. While they didn't work, for obvious reasons, it was still commonplace for women to have to endure this behavior throughout their daily lives. Birth control. In some ways, the Egyptians had a very advanced understanding of medicine and other sciences. Planned parenting wasn't one of these fields. Contraceptives made from things such as tree leaves and even crocodile dung existed as options, though it's unclear exactly how effective they were in preventing pregnancy. On the other side, men also used their ancient techniques to keep from getting pregnant, mainly rubbing onion juice all over themselves. While this might have been quite a revolting experience, it shows that they were still more knowledgeable than many thought. At the very least, they knew that abstinence was the most surefire way to prevent an unwanted birth. If anyone was extremely dedicated, however, crocodile feces would be the option to turn to, given there were relatively no other options at the time. Was crocodile dung a better solution than dealing with 9 months of pregnancy? Probably not, but for some reason the ancient Egyptians thought it was and went through with it. Burial refusal. When men died in ancient Egypt, the custom was obvious. These men were taken right away to be mummified, and no one questioned it. Women, however, were a different matter. In an effort to prevent necrophilia, women were allowed to literally rot before they were mummified. It was a way to prevent any kind of desecration of the corpse. Laws were in place that stated that female mummies should not be touched. Furthermore, no one was even allowed to look at them. It was a kind of morbid respect that was paid to these powerful and beautiful women. After waiting for 3 or 4 days, the embalmers would move in to do their duty and mummify the corpse when it had already decayed substantially. Other precautions were taken as well, but even these didn't prevent the occasional instance of necrophilia. It was clear, though, that the Egyptians took every precaution they could to prevent such an act. While they might have had so many lice that they had to shave their heads bald, they at least had standards in some cases. Photo filters. In modern society, there's an easy way to make ourselves look good. Almost every selfie app has the ability to add photo filters to photos, providing the illusion of clear skin, even complexion, and mighty mummies. In ancient Egypt, trying to appear beautiful was no exception. The only issue for the pharaohs was that they were actually extremely obese. They would order any paintings of them to be done with heavy photo filters, elongated faces, small knees, and torsos that wouldn't be able to be supported by the tiny necks they were given. This all provided the illusion that their health was much better than their obese and clogged arteries actually were. Thankfully, the mummies have been able to show the truth, that the pharaohs were some of the most overweight people in ancient Egypt. It's a good reminder to be careful of photo filters, as they can make us look much better than reality, something the pharaohs found out the hard way. In reality, their priests were ordered to prepare 3 banquets each day, all overflowing with wine, beef, and cake, a diet that likely explained why they did so much editing to make themselves look better. Laxatives. There's no denying that the ancient Egyptians were an extremely advanced society, so much so that they even had laxatives and purgatives. While we think of laxatives today as a way to ease our occasional digestive troubles, the ancient Egyptians used them routinely 3 days each month. Slim and muscular frames were the ideal beauty standard, so the Egyptians used these laxatives to stay trim and healthy. The laxatives and purgatives the Egyptians used were made of castor oil and would be followed by a day full of toilet visits. These were, of course, before plumbing systems were created, so they had to clean the mess themselves. Even diarrhea, a disease that was prevalent during those days, was treated with laxatives. Although it may sound disgusting, this was how the Egyptians kept up with their bodies. Rather than let the disease stay in their bodies, they preferred to remove it as quickly as possible, and for some reason, they decided that this could be done with the help of laxatives. Servant sacrifice. Many people have heard of the legends and rumors that the ancient Egyptians would kill their servants and bury them with the deceased. While this was phased out by the later days of ancient Egypt, the practice of killing servants known as retainer sacrifices was once an integral part of their society. These servants were typically considered privileged, as they were allowed the honor of following their dead masters into the afterlife. However, despite the honor, it was still certainly a nerve-wracking experience, as the servant's life was inextricably linked to the fate of their master. Believe it or not, the servants didn't consider themselves murdered and would often go to their death willingly. The practice of killing servants when their master had died was far more common and strangely much more accepted than you'd expect. Still, this practice didn't last, and during the later years of Egyptian society, it was almost completely non-existent, with only the richest and most influential still participating in this practice. Sun God. While crimes were relatively rare in ancient Egypt and many punishments were lenient, disobeying the sun god was not one of them. A common punishment for those found guilty of any offense related to the sun god was to be burned alive. Those guilty of disrespecting him were considered heretical and would be sentenced to this horrific death, known as immolation in the ancient Egyptian language, as a means of placating the gods. Not only was this death extremely painful, it was considered the ultimate punishment, as it would prevent someone from having a physical existence in the afterlife. Immolation was reserved only for the most serious of offenses, showing how the sun god was held in very high regard by the Egyptians. They weren't about to let you get away with disrespecting him. The ancient Egyptians were willing to let many crimes slide, but this was one of those instances where they decided to back up their beliefs with the ultimate punishment: confessions. The ancient Egyptian police were not as kind as many police we know today. In many countries today, police have taken on a more courteous and respectful approach in attempting to get information. Ancient Egyptian police, on the other hand, were much harsher. It was very common for the police to attempt to beat confessions out of the accused. Those tortured were beaten with sticks, usually on their feet or other parts of the body. It was generally accepted that confessions could be obtained through torture, and this became common practice. It is possible that many innocent people were punished for a crime by being forced to confess. Thankfully, this practice has declined over time as society and humane treatment have become more important. Back in the times of ancient Egypt, however, it was completely acceptable. Many of the legal systems back then were highly imperfect, and this is one example of that. Not only that, but even people thought to be the accomplices of those accused were subjected to this type of treatment as well in order to gain information. Curing baldness.
Why did the ancient Egyptians shave their heads bald? The third of the 10 plagues of Egypt was the invasion of blood-sucking insects.
While many ancient Egyptians simply accepted baldness as a cure for hair lice, what happened when they wanted to grow it back? Egyptians had a variety of solutions that they tried. One suggested the boiling of donkey hoof, ibex fat, tomcat fat, hippopotamus genitals, and of course, porcupine hair. That concoction would be then applied to the scalp for 3 or 4 days. Alternatively, cooking the legs of a female greyhound in oil with a donkey's hoof was also used to cure baldness. Thankfully, we now have better solutions to hair loss and baldness. There were many different treatments for baldness, but none of them were as gruesome or efficient as the ancient Egyptian methods. Nevertheless, people continued to use them, perhaps out of desperation. While there was no proof these cures worked, it seemed as if strange concoctions in the form of boiling and cooking were the only possible things to do to cure baldness at the time. Clay. Clay today is used in pottery and other art forms, but it was also a popular choice among the ancient Egyptians. For religious purposes, the ancient Egyptians often used clay figurines to represent gods and goddesses, or even made them as protective charms. But why exactly was clay so important in the lives of ancient Egyptians? It was believed that humans were made out of clay, and that the gods used their hands to mold life into the form of humans. This type of spiritual importance resonated throughout the entire belief system of the ancient Egyptians. Clay was given a special place in their hearts and understood to be a representation of life itself. This was associated with Khnum, the god of the Nile, known for having a ram's head with hands made of clay. He was seen as the one responsible for creating people and other gods, and so it is clear that clay was held in high regard. According to ancient Egyptian mythology, he created some of the gods from the primordial egg, and when the sun rose, their spirits were placed inside clay figures. Curses. While many of the rumors of curses didn't evolve till later, it's still a horrifying thought that the ancient Egyptians believed in curses. Scattered throughout the tombs, messages were created as warnings to anyone who dared disturb their remains. If someone was unfortunate enough to think they could get away with taking something from the tombs, they would be cursed with horrible fates, such as fatal diseases, vengeful beasts, or even punishments from gods themselves. No one wanted to take the risk of angering an ancient spirit, and those who were brave enough often regret that decision. To this day, Egyptian curses still haunt many as stories of gruesome revenge from the dead. While searches of the tombs haven't revealed anything dangerous or otherworldly, the concept of a curse still makes it one of the most terrifying aspects of ancient Egyptian life. Despite this, rumors continue to circulate, such as a very popular urban legend about how 26 people involved in the opening of King Tut's tomb died mysteriously afterward. Whether or not this is true, it is an eerie reminder of the power that archaic curses still have over us. Oracles. Deciding guilt in ancient Egyptian societies was a bit different than what we are used to today. Though it is seen as superstition in today's world, the Egyptians relied on the magic of oracles in order to decide if someone was innocent or guilty of a crime. These oracles were conducted by a priest or priestess who would ask the gods questions and provide a response that would later decide the fate of the accused. This system was seen as law, meaning that if the oracle claimed that someone was guilty, they would be found guilty with no further investigation. This system was based on the belief that the gods could see all and could provide the correct answer to any question about beliefs, court cases, and other matters of law. Though various gods and goddesses were consulted, one of the primary methods was bringing a statue of the sun god and turning it to the paper that declared innocence or guilt. This reliance on the gods led to the abuse of power by some priests and priestesses. They could easily manipulate the statute to turn toward their own answer and essentially decide court cases based on their own opinion. Thus, it's a horrible system that was unfortunately too easily abused. Baboon police. Another strange and bizarre method that the ancient Egyptians utilized for keeping law and order was the baboon police. Yep, you read that right. Baboons were actually used as police in ancient Egypt. The baboons were trained to assist the police force in catching criminals. Although it's hard to tell how effective this approach was, it certainly is weird that baboons of all animals were used to help keep the law and order. These baboons were treated as symbols of strength and power, and even mummies have been found with tattoos of baboons. It's thought that these baboons were also used to pick fruits and make beer too. So while it's a bizarre fact, it's no wonder that baboons were used in ancient Egypt. Their owners loved these animals, sometimes even ordering statues to be built in their honor. Men's menstruation. The ancient Egyptians believed many strange things. From their love for the sun god to their belief that the earth was flat, it seemed that almost everything was up for debate. Perhaps one of the strangest beliefs was that men had periods. This belief was so pervasive throughout ancient Egypt that it was simply accepted as fact. When enough men had symptoms of anemia, which was usually from drinking unclean water, and they appeared to have what we now recognize as a menstrual cycle, ancient Egyptians simply accepted that men had periods. This idea was so widespread that it was used as an example of a societal norm, and both men and women who had what appeared to be a period were congratulated on having fertile and strong bodies. Crazy, right? In fact, this belief was so widespread that many men weren't accepted as ready to have a family until they had begun bleeding, a sign to the ancient Egyptians that they were finally ready to move out of the house and start creating a family.